This story happened a few years ago when I was still working as a scrap collector in a small town. During the day, my job was at the town's junkyard, where I helped separate and organize what arrived. But it was at night that the heavier work took place. The townspeople who wanted to get rid of scrap would notify me during the day and agree to leave everything outside their houses. Then I would pass by my old combi and do the nighttime collection, picking up what could be reused. I always liked the tranquility of the night, the empty streets, and the silence that was only broken by the sound of the combi's engine and the noise of the trash bags being thrown. I normally relied on the help of an employee, but during those days, he was sick with the flu and couldn't work. So there I was doing everything alone, which meant more work but also more time to think. It was during this time that I began receiving requests from an old street in town, a place I didn't usually pass through. This street was full of old houses, many of which seemed abandoned. It was strange that suddenly so many people there wanted to get rid of so much stuff, but work is work. I accepted the request without questioning and began passing by there every night. On the first nights I visited this street, everything seemed normal, although the place was a bit gloomy. The houses were old, with dusty windows and walls that seemed about to collapse. What really caught my attention, however, were the trash bags that always appeared beside the piles of scrap I would collect. These bags were different, larger and heavier than usual, and were always there as if someone knew I would come and had left them intentionally. Out of curiosity, one night I decided to open one of these bags. What I found unsettled me. Old dolls, clothes that seemed from another era, and black and white photographs, all yellowed with time. They were items that didn't seem to belong in the trash, objects with a story. I started wondering who was throwing away these things and why, and more importantly, why they always appeared alongside the scrap I had to collect. Over time, the items inside the trash bags became increasingly strange, as if each new collection brought me closer to something I shouldn't discover. It started to mess with my head. Unanswered questions wouldn't leave my mind, and the old street with its abandoned houses began to make me uncomfortable. As days passed, my curiosity about the items I found on that street grew. I couldn't get those old dolls, the period clothes, and the black and white photographs out of my mind. It was as if each object told a story no one wanted to hear. Every night as I passed by, I felt more intrigued and at the same time uneasy. I began to notice the street and the houses more carefully. It seemed like no one had lived there for years. The facades were worn, some windows were broken, and the gardens, if you could call them that, were overgrown with weeds. I didn't understand who could be leaving these things behind and why right there. With each new collection, the feeling that something was wrong only increased. I knew I should just do my job and leave, but I couldn't help it. Every time I found another one of those trash bags, I found myself thinking about who or what was behind it, and despite the fear, curiosity began to take over. One night in particular, my curiosity finally won over my fear. After loading the scrap into the combi, I saw another one of those trash bags, larger and heavier than usual. My heart raced, but I knew I needed to find out what was happening. I stopped the combi, looked around to make sure I was alone, and approached the bag. When I opened it, I was startled. Inside, among the usual strange items, there was something different. An old book with yellowed pages and a worn cover. But what really terrified me was what was written on the cover. My name in large, faded letters followed by a date. The following day. For a moment, I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Fear took over me in a way I had never felt before. How was that possible? Who would do such a thing? And more importantly, why? The date on the book was the same as the following night, and the idea that something terrible might happen wouldn't leave my mind. I put the book back in the bag, closed it, and ran to the combi. I didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. Something very wrong was happening on that street, and now it seemed directly connected to me. The next day, I went to work at the junkyard as usual, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about the book I had found the night before, with my name on the cover and that ominous date. It was as if the discovery had awakened something in me, something I couldn't shake off. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. I was terrified. At the junkyard, while sorting and organizing the pieces, my colleagues noticed I wasn't well and asked if I was sick or if something had happened. But I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what I had found under those conditions? Who would believe such a story? So I just shook my head and said I was tired and dealing with the work alone while my assistant was sick. The fear was consuming me from within. During the day, I tried to distract myself with work, but everything reminded me of the street, the trash bags, and that book. As night began to fall, the tension increased. I knew I would have to go back there to do the collection, but the thought of that date in the book left me in a panic. That night, when I got into the combi to start my rounds, my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. The combi, which had always been my companion for so many nights, now felt like a coffin on wheels, taking me to a destination I wanted to escape from. But I had no choice. The work needed to be done. When I arrived at the old street, my heart almost stopped. I knew something was about to happen, but I had no idea what it could be. And worst of all, despite all my fear, I was alone. There was no one to share the weight of the growing terror inside me. The feeling of unease was so strong that I almost decided to turn back, but responsibility stopped me. Even with all the fear, I had a job to do. I got out of the combi, looked around, and began to load the scrap that was waiting, trying to ignore the darkness that seemed to be surrounding me. Then I heard something that made me freeze, a faint sound as if someone was whispering my name. I looked around but saw nothing. The sound seemed to come from all directions, but the street was completely deserted. My heart was beating so fast that I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears. I decided it was time to finish the work as quickly as possible and get out of there. I threw the last piece of scrap into the truck and was about to get into the combi when I noticed something strange. The combi's door, which I was sure I had closed, was ajar. The fear I was feeling turned into panic. With a trembling hand, I held the door and took a look inside. There, on the passenger seat, was a book I had found the night before. I had left the book in that trash bag. I hadn't taken it with me, and now it was there, open to the page with the date that matched that night. But what was even more terrifying was what I saw underneath the book, an old black and white photo showing a man next to a combi, a man who looked exactly like me. I couldn't breathe properly. It couldn't be real. How did it end up there? I picked up the photo with trembling hands and, when I turned it over, saw something handwritten. He knew he shouldn't return. At that moment, the street lights began to flicker and the combi's engine started on its own. The sound of the engine roaring in the silence of the night almost made my heart stop. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't respond. That's when the engine shut off abruptly, and everything fell silent again, except for the sound of my heart racing uncontrollably. I decided there was nothing more to do there. I left the photo and the book on the seat, slammed the combi's door shut, and got out of there as fast as I could. That street, that night, I knew I would never forget. After that night, my life changed. The next day, I went straight to the junkyard owner and asked to be transferred to another route. I told him I was having health problems and that the nighttime work wasn't doing me any good. But I didn't say a word about what had really happened. Who would believe such a story? And honestly, I preferred to forget. I spent days trying to get that image out of my head. The book with my name, the date, the old photo of a man who looked exactly like me. Even during the day while working at the junkyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something had stayed on that street waiting for me to return. But I never went back. I started avoiding that part of town entirely, and when someone mentioned that street, I changed the subject, pretending it was nothing. But deep down, I knew I had seen something that should never have been found, something that was connected to me in a way I would never understand. Years have passed, and the memory of that night still haunts me. The combi, the book, the photo, they are things I prefer not to talk about. Sometimes I wonder if I was the only one to experience it, or if others have encountered similar things on that old street. But one thing is certain. There are some places and some secrets that are better left untouched.